Hi, class. About a year after the United States will declare war on Great Britain in June of 1812, a conflict will erupt in the American South, and this is going to include parts of Alabama that will become known as the Creek War. The Creek War is a complicated affair. I can't do it justice in a few minutes' time, but I'm going to give you the high points and try to explain what's happening. The Creek War was really a civil war between two factions within the Creek Nation and an international struggle where the United States, Spain, Britain, and other Indian tribes are going to play a part with what happens to the Creek Nation in Alabama. America's ultimate victory in this conflict is going to shape the outcome of the broader war with Britain, and it's going to gain significant territory for white settlement in the American South. Class, it changes life for the land of the Indians forever. To better understand what's happening in our area, we need a little background. So after the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1700s, Georgia, the territory of Georgia, in the state of Georgia, is going to experience an explosion in population, and a lot of settlers are looking for opportunities to acquire land in the western part of the state. This is largely occupied by Creek Indians. Cherokees were more in the North Georgia area. Creek homeland included riverside towns, big crop fields, and hunting grounds that extended into what is now Alabama and Mississippi, mainly Alabama. The Creeks were, class, a historically and culturally divided group. There was the Upper Creek Indians, located primarily between the Coosa and the Tallapoosa rivers and their tributaries, and the Lower Creek Indians found near the Flint and Chattahoochee River valleys in western Georgia. Now, before 1790, Georgia had made some treaties with the Lower Creek tribes where they had ceded some land to the state, but the Upper Creek leaders refused to acknowledge the validity of those agreements. This disagreement really results in a lot of Creek attacks on Georgia settlers in the disputed territory. Also in the 1790s, the United States government made its first treaty with the Creeks. And this is one where the Lower and Upper Creek leadership participated. In these treaties, in subsequent treaties, the Creeks continued to cede more lands to the United States. So really, what are the sources of conflict for the Creek War? So besides, losing land to the federal government had, under Thomas Jefferson, instituted something called a civilization program, to civilize the natives. And they had implemented this and promoted it by the way of Indian agent for the United States, Benjamin Hawkins. We've covered him in the textbook, and you'll continue to hear more about him. This civilization program, besides trying to attempt to assimilate natives to Americans, citizenship, it created indebtedness among native tribes to our federal government. What the government did is they provided stores and sold goods to create debt among the Creeks and other native tribes to the federal government. It didn't just happen with the Creeks. This program of teaching agriculture, means to the Creeks, had some success with the Lower Creeks. But the conversion of changing from a hunting and bartering economy to a market economy did provide some wealth among some of the Creeks, particularly those of mixed blood ancestry with a white father and a Creek mother. But it caused a lot of resentment between those Lower Creeks and many Upper Creeks who opposed assimilation with whites. Now Benjamin Hawkins, came in and created a governing body for the Creeks and a national council, which intentionally circumvented the previous polity of town headmen. The council is going to redistribute political power from town level or tribe level to the national level. And Hawkins was pretty smart. He exercised great influence over who sat on that council and selected those Creeks sympathetic to the United States, or who seemed to be sympathetic. Traditionalist Creeks resented the National Council and tried to eliminate it. Debts to the government were increasing. Pressure is mounting. And then another whole new layer of problems is traders that they had previously been working with, the Creeks had been working with, tried to begin using alcohol in trades for goods. And this is really going to cause a new problem within the Indian nations. Further causing division occurs when the United States government tries to extend the federal road through Creek territory. You're going to read all about that in the chapter, and connect Georgia with the Mississippi territory. Alabama, during this time, is part of the Mississippi territory. William McIntosh, a very powerful Lower Creek leader with strong ties to the United States federal government, convinces Creeks opposing the road to support it. We need to support this project in 1805. And though the pathway provided a few Creeks with a source of income from tolls and businesses along the route, the track brought an unintended consequences of a flood of settlers into the Mississippi territory, adding another layer of friction between whites and Indians. And as tensions between the U.S. and Great Britain are increasing, the United States government is authorizing further expansion on the federal road to facilitate rapid movement of military forces to the Gulf Coast. So in the middle of all this tense situation enters the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. And this is going to really be, in my opinion, the proverbial spark that's ultimately going to ignite war in the Creek Nation. He claimed some familial ties to the Creeks, and Tecumseh was a native of the Great Lakes region, and he was really a leader in the Native American resistance to United States settlement in the Old Northwest. And along with his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, Tecumseh believed an Indian confederacy was the only way to ensure survival of native tribes in face of this mounting encroachment. So he was trying to combine all of the Native American tribes together, okay? I mean, you have to understand Native Indian tribes typically were not necessarily loyal to other Native Indians. It was more tribal related, like I mentioned in the last lecture. And he was in his efforts, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, they called for a halt to American colonization and a return to the native traditional ways of life. And in the summer and fall of 1811, he travels through the Southeast in an attempt to rally all of the civilized tribes, is what scholars refer to, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and try to get them to come together for his cause. And Tecumseh was largely unsuccessful with the Choctaws and the Chickasaws. But Tecumseh found a receptive audience with these Upper Creeks, many of whom he addressed in present-day central Alabama. And those Upper Creeks lived along the northern reaches of Alabama and the Tallapoosa River, remember, and they represented about half the Creek Nation. Relatively more removed from white society than the Lower Creek, who, again, tended to be a little bit more sympathetic to the government. All right, so while no transcript of the Tecumseh speech at the Creek Annual Council meeting survives, what we believe that he talked about was this urge to abandon American styles of agriculture, return to traditional folk ways, even if it leads to armed conflict with the U.S. Now, regardless of the exact wording, the message by Tecumseh was clear and timely for those inclined by circumstances to agree to his call, pointing to the appearance of a comet that glowed its brightest just as he arrived. A comet came through. They were encouraged by what he said even more. He was a very eloquent speaker, and the Creeks that ended up supporting him came to be called Red Sticks, referring to their traditional Creek war clubs. So, what really started the Creek War? No one really knows how old the community of Burnt Corn, Alabama is, but many historians claim that whites, blacks, Native Indians were living in harmony in the Burnt Corn area for almost a century before the fall of around 1810, 1811, with pretty good trade relations, class. There was some intermarriage, there was some reliable treaties. And so if this is true, the burnt corn community was founded sometime in the early 1700s and is older than the United States as an independent country. But unfortunately, class, the peace is not to last in Alabama. Inspired by this very eloquence of Tecumseh and their own prophets, the Creeks, again known as the Red Sticks, sought aggressively to return their society to a traditional way of life. Now, there's some Creek leaders, and you can read more about them in the textbook. William Weatherford, later known as Red Eagle, Peter McQueen, and Minowa. I love this guy. They had actually been allies of the British during the Wars of 1812, and they violently clashed with other chiefs of the Creek Nation over this white encroachment and these civilized programs administered by Hawkins. And before the Creek War began, the Red Sticks were able to keep a lot of their activities that they were plotting and planning secret from the older chiefs, this younger generation. So in February of 1813, the spark, I think, for the war is when a small party of Red Sticks led by Little Warrior was returning from Detroit when they massacred 2 families of settlers along the Ohio River. Now, Hawkins was outraged. He demanded that the Creeks turn over Little Warrior and his 6 companions. And instead of handing them over to the federal agents, the old chiefs decided to execute them, the murderers themselves. Now, this decision was really the spark that ignited the Civil War between the Creeks. So the Creeks from the upper towns, Red Sticks, immediately begins attacking the lower towns within the Creek Nation. The lower towns had taken steps to assimilate themselves into white culture. Remember, they kind of got along and were leaning toward, the federal government. The Red Sticks came in and destroyed everything that they perceived to have come from the white man, such as domesticated animals, dishes, homespun cloths. But now the Red Sticks were not above confiscating the guns and steel blades that they found. They didn't want to destroy that. So Big Warrior, speaker for the Creeks and a nominal voice of the moderates, caught in the middle, knew he could not hand over Little Warrior to the whites and maintain respect and unity among his own people. And neither could he absolve the guilty and move on. So to make matters worse, after Big Warrior had executed some of those responsible, Little Warrior himself escaped down the Black Warrior River and started gathering supporters among the Creeks there. Little Warrior, it now seemed clear, wanted a war between the Creeks to decide their cultural future. And the older chiefs understood that they're going to have to oblige him. So, as all this white settlement had sparked tensions, the Creeks also viewed it as collateral. If war must come, they reasoned, better to keep the land-hungry Americans out of it. Thus, Big Warrior pronounced Little Warrior's life a forfeit and moved to calm the white fears of collusion. This is what he wrote to a territorial judge in April. You must not think from any conduct of the Little Warrior that the chiefs are any foes of the white. Should he commit any depredation there, do not by any rash means fall upon our villages that are above you, for they're friendly and will not do anything that is not agreeable to the chiefs. But Big Warrior gave the judge, he said, go kill Little Warrior. And he said, we don't want any more atrocities visited upon the white settlements. Big Warrior also trying to get the judge to reach out to the Choctaws and the Chickasaws down the road to bring Little Warrior down. But the first clashes between the Red Sticks and the American white settlers that took place when a group of Mississippi Territory soldiers, remember this is the territory, Mississippi Territory, so Mississippi Territory militia, stopped a party of Red Sticks who were returning from Florida in July of 1813. Now, the Red Sticks had been receiving munitions and supplies and weapons from the Spanish governor at Pensacola. So remember, Spanish still occupies Florida, class. Now, the Red Sticks fled the scene, but the soldiers began looting what they had lost, dropped, left behind. And the Red Sticks, who saw those soldiers becoming carried away with their looting of what they had dropped, retaliated with a big surprise attack. And this happened in the territory or the area of Burnt Corn. And the Battle of Burnt Corn, as the exchange became known, really broadened the Creek War to begin to include American forces now. So no longer was it a civil war. They had brought in the Americans, the white settlers. And the Red Sticks drove off the militia, and they really saw this Battle of Burnt Corn as energizing their success. Unfortunately, it's going to lead to more violence. So let's talk a little bit about what happened next. And nothing really could prepare one Captain J.P. Kennedy for what he witnessed when he approached the smoldering ruins of Fort Mims, formerly known as the Sam Mims Farm, in September of 1813. He had been ordered, this captain had been ordered by the Mississippi Territorial Militia to inspect this fort that they had heard had been attacked by surprise by Red Stick warriors, hundreds of Red Stick warriors, a little more than a week prior. And although news of this battle at the fort had slowly trickled into surrounding American white settlers and settlements, few knew the details of the encounter. Kennedy, the guy that was sent in by Mississippi militia, he was stunned by what he saw. His unflinching, detailed report of the scene not only informed military authorities about the conflict that had taken place, but captured the horrific nature of this brief but brutal war that was about to commence in earnest and radically alter the United States and the territory of Mississippi. This is what he wrote. The place presented an awful spectacle, and the tragic fate of our friends increased the horror of the scene. At the east gate of the stockade lay Indians, Negroes, women, men, children in one promiscuous room. He went on to note in grisly detail that the dead were scalped, and females of every age were barbarously and savage-like butchered in a manner which neither decency nor language can convey. He said pregnant women were cut open and their children's heads tomahawked. This really summed up sentiments of those across the nation. He noted that men's hearts were torn with contending passions by turns of grief and burning revenge. So this is, really going to lead to the feeling of revenge. More than 250 American soldiers, settlers, and slaves, and an unknown number of Red Stick Creeks were killed in that Battle of Fort Mims in August of 1813. American settlers had constructed the crude stockade fort, located about 40 miles north of Mobile, as a place of temporary refuge, as all these tensions with the Red Sticks and the war between the Creeks had mounted. Although it's not the first clash in what's going to, become part of the Creek War, the battle proved conclusively that American Indian relations in the Mississippi Territory had really taken a fateful turn. Described not as a battle, but as the Fort Mims Massacre in contemporary papers, the affair shocks the nation and plunges the United States into a war that will eventually become entangled with the larger War of 1812. But hey, natives looked at this attack, they looked at this like a great victory. The Red Sticks' goal was their plan was to strike at mixed blood creeks that had taken refuge at the fort. And despite some efforts by Creek leaders to intervene, the massacre left 400 to 500 people dead, and panic spread through the American southeastern frontier, and they demanded government intervention. And federal forces now, remember, were busy fighting the British and Northland Woodland Indian tribes, so the southern states had to call up their militias to deal with the threat. So after the Battle of Burnt Corn, the United States began preparations to take action against the Creek. And they said if the Spanish are found to be supporting the Creeks, we're going to, a strike against Pensacola is going to be justified. They better stay out of this. But class, we're still going to take down Florida. They just don't know it yet. In response to the massacre, where you're going to see many will form against the Creeks. The Tennessee legislature authorized 5,000 militia. 2,500 of those is going to be under the command of Colonel Andrew Jackson. In addition to the actions of Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi, Benjamin Hawkins organizes the friendly Lower Town Creeks under William McIntosh, And all of the whites were very concerned about this. This is, you know, they're going to have to put a stop to this in their minds. The Red Sticks continued from Burnt Corn and Fort Mims just to continue their move on to other forts and communities, and the violence continued to spread. But eventually, class, they're going to end up taking refuge in the loop of the Tallahassee River at a place called Horseshoe Bend. By March, Andrew Jackson will move against the Red Stick force concentrated on the Tallapoosa River at Horseshoe Bend. It's in 1814. He first is going to move south along the Coosa River and about half the distance to the creek position, and he's going to establish an outpost there. Leaving that garrison, he moves on with a force of about 3,000 militia and 600 Cherokee, friendly to the government, and Lower Creek allies. So Cherokees and Creek allies. The Battle of the Horseshoe Bend occurs in March of 27 and was a decisive victory for Jackson and the federal government, effectively ending the Red Stick resistance. His forces charged the Red Stick's defensive barricade and attacked Indian allies that were located across the river. They were outarmed and outnumbered from the beginning. They were overwhelmed, and the Red Sticks were massacred in large numbers. Jackson declared no more than 20 of the more than 1,000 natives escaped. Class Minowa was somebody we've read about and talked about. He was one of the ones who escaped. In August of 1814, the Creeks ended up being forced to sign a treaty with called the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which ceded 23 million acres, half of Alabama and part of southern Georgia, to the United States government. With the Red Stick menace subdued, Jackson was able to focus on the Gulf Coast region. And I just want to add this, on his initiative, he invaded Spanish Florida, and he drove a British force out of Pensacola, and then he defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. And in 1818, Jackson is going to once again invade Florida. Remember, it didn't matter. We had our eyes on Florida, and he knew some of the Red Stick leaders had even fled there. And this event will be known as the First Seminole War. But as a result of all these victories, Jackson's a national figure and a war hero, and he eventually will become the 7th president of the United States in 1829. Now, the land ceded by the Creeks, again, 20 million acres, most of the ones who lived on that land were driven from their ancestral homes to Oklahoma. And this former Creek land will make up much of the Mississippi Territory that later becomes the new state of Alabama. After the War of 1812, the federal government began to force all southeastern Indians to exchange their remaining lands for land in Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Most natives are going to resist leaving their ancestral homes, but with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, Indian removal was established as a national policy. States quickly passed laws to ensure jurisdiction over Indians living within their borders, and President Jackson informed the Indians that the federal government was helpless to interfere with any help for them. He told them their only option was to comply with removal. And this went for all civilized nations, class: Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. I guess they regretted helping Jackson now. In Alabama, removal was completed by the 1830s, though a few native Alabamians, such as the Porch Band of Creek Indians, escaped removal and remain in Alabama to this day. So the land of Indians in Alabama was no more, class. As usual, please keep in touch.